I don't have any cool background music for today. I tried to do something with my computer and then it ended up not cooperating. So it's like, yeah. Anyways, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Podcast. And today we have a so last week was a more silly topic because it was just kind of me telling whatever stories about my crazy life. And then like the weeks before that was a much more serious tone of like, well, of course that the first few weeks of the podcast was kind of meant to set the tone of how I would do all these kind of streams later on. How I would do any kind of podcast type stream was that, how to engage in ideas and the importance of evaluating what is worth knowing, anything that I or anyone else talks about, right? And so I just wanted to put that at the forefront. And I spent the first 2 weeks doing that. Last week I just kind of told funny stories and had funny chats and whatever. This week is kind of an in-between, right? And this is where, once again, it's important to really evaluate anything that you're being told. I'm going to change this lighting. What the heck? I can never get this lighting perfectly. But that's because OBS shows you one thing that's really different from probably what you actually see. And so that just makes it all the more complicated, right? But anyway, I won't go too deep into our topic yet. I'm just going to give this introduction and kind of ramble a bit for the beginning. But today's topic, as you saw in the video title for me to be a little snarky, was about, I called it the ninth, video games and the ninth commandment. And of course, I'll get to more of that in a bit, but I'll kind of talk about the inspiration of this video. And the idea that I wanted to get to behind this video, and I'm going to use video gaming and the ninth commandment as kind of the main centerpieces of what I'm talking about. But the fundamental idea that what inspired me to kind of do this conversation is the idea of how dangerous. I was inspired by the opposite, I guess, and that's how dangerous it is that like on the internet, you can't trust anyone on the internet, right? Because people have their avatar or whatever to like make a fake face for themselves, and behind that you can kind of say whatever you want. You can be deceitful and willfully so, but that of course is a bad thing, right? Because of course if you go around just lying to people, that will cause all kinds of problems for you down the line, right? I mean, who can trust you if people find out you're just a BS liar, behind your fancy little avatar, right? And on top of this, people use that invulnerability behind the behind the computer screen. There's no accountability, right? But on a moral level, as human beings that want to be good to each other in general, fundamentally we should always be mindful of always trying to always being truthful. I mean, of course, there are exceptions when it comes to like, there's only one exception. I talked about that in my Bible reading stream, shameless promotion there, but that's a very far in between, and that hardly ever happens in the regular day-to-day living. So, but for the most part, we should always be truthful, right? And the reason why I say there's the exception is because I know there's always that one smart ass who says like, oh, but what about the people in Nazi Germany and they lied to protect the Jews? It's like, well, that's the exception, because if the exception to the do not lie rule is if you telling the truth leads directly to someone else getting murdered, right? That is the exception. And so when people try to be a smart ass and be like, oh, but the whole Nazi Germany thing, I mean the Bible even gives you a story of that same example, right? If you want to check out this story of where there's an exception to the lying rule, is in Exodus 1. And I'll just kind of tell this story briefly. I've definitely done a more in-depth and study of this story in my Exodus reading, and it was in Exodus chapter 1, so I did it pretty early in that series too. You can find the whole playlist. I think I probably have to update it. No, the Exodus one is probably all updated. I haven't updated the Samuel stuff. I've been pretty bad on that. I should probably update. a lot of the playlists on the channel. But the Exodus one should all be there. And in Exodus 1, there's a story about these two midwives, basically. And the Pharaoh commands them to, like, kill a whole bunch of, like, the Hebrew babies. He tells the midwives to kill the Hebrew babies, and the women are like, well, we're obviously not going to do that, right? Like, that would be terrible, right? We're not freaking monsters. So they decide to let, to spare all the Hebrew boys. And then the Pharaoh comes back to them. He's just like, yo, why didn't you do what I told you? And they straight up lie to his face, right? They just made up some, poppycock story about how, like, oh, the Hebrew women, like, bear children fast, and before we even get there, and they're already gone with their kids, and we can't do anything about it, right? Just straight up lie to the Pharaoh's face. And then, of course, the Bible gives you the statement that would appear kind of like, huh, interesting, where God blesses these women for lying to the Pharaoh, right? But essentially, he blesses them for their good moral compass of not murdering a bunch of children, right? And so, I mean, that would be the only exception to the lying rule. But for the most part, we should always, be honest and truth telling, right? Because, I mean, fundamental, like, and this is where this video kind of comes down to, right? And then if it wasn't obvious, for those of you who don't know your Bibles very well, the 9th commandment in the Bible is do not lie. Well, that's the short part of it. The actual verse, which is found in Exodus 20, verse 16, it says, you shall not give false testimony about your neighbor, which is a fancy wording of simply don't say things that are untrue. That's basically how you interpret that, right? Don't say things that are untrue. And of course, the part about your neighbor is because, the idea that it can hurt people. And that's fundamentally why do not lie and honesty is so important, right? Because what people think like, oh, a little white lie might not matter or anything, just to get myself out of trouble. But in actuality, lying in general hurts people, right? Our words have power. And that's definitely true on the internet as well. Our words have power. So it's all the more reason to be truthful. Even though on the internet, it's so easy to get away with just like lying to people because no one's going to immediately catch you, right? Like, if you could say something to me, just straight up tell me a lie, and I have to take what you say as truth at face value, right? But then, of course, those people who do that would be no better than the people they accuse of being like authoritative, right? Because, I mean, you think of like any kind of all the authoritative, like, I hate using this example, but it's kind of like a recent one that's, every Canadian has it on the forefront of their mind, is like politicians. I mean, Americans deal with this too all the time, right? Like, politicians just straight up lie through their teeth, right? And no wonder nobody trusts them, right? It's no wonder. But, I think an important thing is to be truthful and to always be truthful, right? And so this is where the other half of this video, topic comes in, is video gaming and truth telling. And the interesting thing about how, a funny thing of why I'll tell you a funny story first. And that was how some of you guys might have heard this story. It's not really a story. It's just kind of like a interesting, I'm an anecdote of the opposite of many problems of modern Christianity. And that's the idea that, like, okay, I'll tell you the story first. So I remember when I was growing up, I was in high school, and I was hanging out with a buddy. Him and I are the same age, and we went to the same church, and we did this kind of Bible study together. Because like we're teenagers and want to read the Bible more, and it's a good idea to, right? As we enter our more formative years, we should read the Bible more and really pay attention to what it says, as opposed to just what your Sunday school teacher says, right? So we were talking about movies and stuff, and my buddy told me he had never seen The Lion King, and I was baffled. I was just like, what do you mean you've never seen The Lion King, right? Like, that movie's amazing. It's a classic, right? Even as a kid, I loved it, right? The Lion King's a great movie. And so, by the way, we're going to mostly get into the serious part here, but we're finishing the preamble with this story. So I was like, what do you mean you've never seen The Lion King, right? And it didn't really occur to me when I was younger that I was the exception to the case. Now you hear a lot of stories and like, especially in like Hollywood stories, where like, and the media loves parading these kind of stories of those. Because I think the problem that the way the media portrays this, and unfortunately, Christians have to just deal that they've kind of screwed up in their parenting skills. Christian parents, I should say, really should just like, yeah, you got to realize you did kind of screw up here. It's just the way it is. But you can't let the media allow your failure to be like a triumph for them, right? And so this failure I'm talking about is how there's many a Christian parents that would shelter their kids as they grew up, and their kids would have very little exposure to a lot of secular works or um, secular works. Wow, that may sound like such an old person, right? To like stuff, to non-Christian media and whatever, right? So for the story with my buddy who's never seen The Lion King, right? And so the objection to Christians watching The Lion King was because like, well, it has like African shamanism in it. I mean, like Rafiki, right? Like he does the whole like ritualistic thing with like the birth of Simba and all that stuff, and of course his whole like communing with the spirits of the land with like the wind telling him that like Simba lives and all that stuff, right? And there's a lot of African shamanism mythology to that and yada 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 and stuff like that. And so because that stuff was in the movie, like a lot of kids, Christian kids, weren't allowed to see stuff like The Lion King. And my buddy was one such person. He had never seen The Lion King until like I exposed it to it like a terrible Christian I am, right? So I exposed my friend to like stuff like The Lion King. When we were teenagers, right? And that's a weird thing to think, right? Like, but anyway, as I got older, though, I started realizing that I was actually the exception because I thought my friend was the exception, like that he was like sheltered. But what I later learned was that I was me being like more exposed to this kind of stuff. That I was the exception, and that a lot of people I knew were kind of a lot more, um, you know, smothered in a bubble, for to use that more harsher illustration that I'm sure many Christians recognize. But then, of course, you get to the whole like Hollywood stories where like Katy Perry is a great example of this, right? Where she had lived in that bubbled Christian life, and her parents were very like strict on how she presented herself, right? And especially with the way that she looked, right? She was a very attractive young woman with like a nice body and all that, right? And so you got to be very modest, dress up properly, and all that stuff, right? And so, but when I was growing up, I was the exception. Apparently, I was the exception to the case, right? So growing up, my parents allowed me to play all kinds of video games, and my parents did something that was very unconventional. But I think there was a lot of wisdom in how they did it, and it had helped me, and it kind of inspires me of how I would raise my kids, assuming I ever have any. Um, Kind of inspired me how I would raise my kids in being able to be engaged in the world, right? And to live in the world but not be of the world. And so, for instance, like I played a lot of Japanese RPGs. Love those things, right? But the weird thing was that like my parents would watch me play, and then we would talk about the story of the game because part of it was like it was to help me in my reading skills. I think that was why my parents were actually okay with me playing like RPGs. It was actually meant to help me with my reading skills because when I was growing up in school, I actually had I struggled a lot as a student. I struggled a lot, especially in my elementary school years. I struggled a lot. So my parents tried to find ways to help me be a better reader. But even with like being exposed to like reading a bit of Harry Potter, I didn't even get into it until I was older because my reading skills was actually pretty bad. So video gaming was actually a way that my parents helped me develop reading skills. And so playing like Final Fantasy VII, for instance, a very a story that'd be like, oh, it's got like all these anti-religious themes and whatever, right? Final Fantasy VI has a lot of that too, right? Well, most Final Fantasy games do, and most RPGs do, right? Like the church is evil kind of thing. But what my parents would do is, they would watch me play the game, and we would go through the story together, right? As if it's like an interesting way of doing like family reading time, right? That was kind of what my parents did. And that really, that exposed me to a lot of ideas that I didn't know and I didn't think about. When you play a game as a kid or as an early teenager, you don't think about the story as deeply as you should. But, you know, my parents who, been around for a while, right? They can understand these, deeper concepts and more philosophical concepts and whatnot. And they were able to engage me and talk about those things. And we would talk about those things and I was very engaged in that. And that actually helped me a lot as I got older because I became really good at reading and really was able to articulate thoughts and ideas because I understood them pretty well. And so I found out that I was the exception. Like, I don't think anyone else's families did this, right? And I think my parents were kind of ahead of the curve, right? In how they raised me. And so that was something interesting that and then as I got older, it's just got more baffling that people live these sheltered lives. But something that, now going to the actual topic at hand, because now I've transitioned to my religious life and then video gaming and talking about those two things together. There's something very important that video gaming teaches you about how to be a good person. And that is, and this is not just true of video game, but I'm going to use video gaming as my main illustration of this, and that is the importance of truth telling and how to establish society, community, and by extension society. I should have started smaller and then worked big, right? And video gaming actually teaches you this very well. Of course, I'm going to use RPGs more often as my frame of reference because they are a lot more text heavy. And of course, there are video games that do their little twist, right? But of course, with the RPG narrative, okay, so I got to make a little dissension here and talk about what I mean when I talk about how video gaming is actually good in relation to the 9th commandment, do not lie. Now we're going to the actual topic here. Now I'm going to separate the idea of a RPG's narrative versus how video games work. And I'm going to talk about video games more mechanically, which I didn't say explicitly in the description of the video. But that's what I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to talk about video games on a mechanical level and how they're actually important on how to build a society. And that is through the power of truth telling. Now, if you've ever watched any angry video game nerd videos or any of those game critics or whatever that talk about how to make a good game versus how to make a really bad game, games that they'll often bring up is okay, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde on the NES is how you don't make a video game. And the idea was, the reason why they would say that is because a game like that tells you nothing, right? You just thrown into the game and you're supposed to try and figure out everything, but the game does nothing to help you with that, right? It's not like a game with good game design. Let's take even old school Mega Man or any Mega Man game really, and how to do good game design. So in old school Mega Man, you have your directional buttons, and then you have the A button for jump and the B button for shooting, right? And so the idea is that the game tells you that Mega Man can jump and he can shoot, right? That's his thing, right? And then of course you learn more advanced mechanics as you play through the game, beat the bosses, get the weapons, etc. Right? And so good game design just tells you the rules of the game. Mega Man jumps, he shoots, you figure out how to do puzzles with jumping and shooting, right? You get past all the obstacles by jumping and shooting. And so the game had to tell you this, and you have to assume what they're telling you is true, right? That is how Mega Man works. If the game designers lied to you, you wouldn't play Mega Man because you wouldn't know what to do if the game wasn't forthcoming about how to play the game. And so, this is a fundamental thing about why rules exist, right? Rules exist so that you have a product that functions, right? This is true about sports. This is true about, how a group of people work in a community together, schools, whatever, right? Especially in video games, this is true. That, you need a set of rules. And rules only really work if there is honesty behind them, right? And I think that's another thing I kind of learned when it comes to some of my friends that grew up in their little Christian bubbles that didn't get as much exposure to other mediums like video games and stuff like I did, right? And of course, to be fair, I did grow up in a time where if you were the video gamer, you were like the ostracized nerd, right? Because I'm that old, right? Video gaming was the more niche thing to do, and then like all the cool kids were, you know, athletic superstars and whatever. Yours truly was not, but that kind of thing, right? That kind of jock environment you see in like those teen movies, which is not an accurate depiction anymore of what society is like, but that's how things were when I was growing up. But an important thing that I learned was, and you know, when like my parents would be sitting behind me and we would be playing video games together, or they would watch me play a game and they would kind of backseat drive from time to time, because that's the other thing too, where like you think an RPG is like a one player game, but then here I am with like it's kind of a family event where I'm playing the game, but my parents are there like kind of helping me along, and that only works because everything the game tells you, you assume it to be true, right? On a mechanical level. And so, you take like, let's take a typical role playing game, right? That has a complex system. So let's talk about like, I swear, I'm going to get a copy of this game somehow and stream it. And that would be Chrono Trigger, because that game's amazing, right? So Chrono Trigger is a RPG about time travel and whatever, but that's not important right now. What is important is the mechanics of the game to talk about. And so basically, the idea of you have your normal attacks, you have your technique abilities, and then you have your items, right? And then your technique abilities, there's some variation with them because each character has different abilities, and then based on some abilities, your characters can learn like combo techniques, and it's pretty cool. But anyway, what happens is to understand the rules of how that works, the game kind of gives you a brief introduction, but not really. You kind of have to figure a lot of it. But the game introduces the idea of like techniques, and then there's a way that your characters can actually do like combo techniques. And so when the game tells you that, you have to assume it to be true, right? That the game wouldn't just lie to you about like what to do. And then based on what the game told you, and then based on what you can figure out from how different ability combinations work, you can do all the different dual techniques. And that's what makes a game like Chrono Trigger really fun to play, right? And it's the rules that make the game work really well. The classic example of the importance of truth telling can be played out in the classic, any classic Dungeons and Dragons type game, and of course the video game that kind of really borrowed elements from this, although it's kind of gone way crazy overboard nowadays, is Final Fantasy. If you've ever played the original Final Fantasy, the charm of that game was that it acts like a traditional Dungeons and Dragons fetch quest kind of game. So basically the idea is you go from place to place and you talk to every NPC you can to get information. And then based on the information that you get from all these NPCs, you then figure out what to do in the game. And so in a classical fetch quest Dungeons and Dragons kind of game, what the game tells you, you have to assume it's true, right? And so think about how asinine video games would be if like any kind of text box, you did not know if it was true or not, right? Some guy could just straight out tell you a lie. Two people give you extremely contradicting instructions, and then neither of them are true, right? Or anything like that. Imagine if video games were made like that. Not just, I'm talking about on a mechanical level, not like when stories try to do the plot twist of like this character is evil, so they lie to you. That's a little, I'm not talking about that, right? Which is a common thing in a lot of RPGs, because the church is evil, motif in video games tends to do that, right? The church says one thing even though they're liars. FF10 is Final Fantasy 10 is the clear classic case in point of this idea, right? And of course, there's Seymour Guado. The moment you look at him, villain, right? He straight up just lies through his teeth. But I'm not talking about like in-game text like that. I'm just talking about like the mechanics, right? So in a Final Fantasy game, when a character tells you like this is where you gotta go to progress the game, right? Now you as the player you have to assume that's true, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to beat the game, right? Because the idea of any game is that it has to be beatable, or else you wouldn't bother playing it, because then you would be like, why bother? Well, when I say beatable, it has to have like clear like completion ideas. Of course, there's like MMOs that are a little different, right? But how MMOs work is based on like progression levels, and then of course like you finish up to a point and you quote unquote beat the game until new content comes out. That's a little different, but your traditional RPG, right? When the game tells you you got to go to X place, right? You have to assume that the game is telling you something true, right? That is what you're supposed to be doing. Because imagine if like, okay, so you're playing like, okay, let's say you're playing like Final Fantasy VII. Let's go to Final Fantasy VII, back to Final Fantasy VII, right? And then after you leave Midgar, which is still pretty early in the game, you're supposed to follow the trail of Sephiroth. Spoilers, it's not really Sephiroth, but is it really a spoiler for an over 20-year-old game? But anyway, so you're supposed to follow Sephiroth, right? And so eventually it leads you to Junon, right? And the game hints at like, oh, there was this guy, and the guy in a weird black cloak going this particular way, and then you kind of find out that this guy in the black coat, who Cloud assumes to be Sephiroth, is going to Junon. And that's how you're supposed to figure out, without the people knowing this game like the back of their hands nowadays, right? Because the game is that old. If you were playing the game for the very first time, and you had to figure out what to do, right? You would have to trust that when the NPCs tell you that, like, oh, there's this dude in a black cloak going to Junon, you assume that's where you have to go. And then, of course, the challenge of the game is, how do you get there, right? Through the damn Mithril mines with that damn snake. Like, if you know what I'm talking about. But, imagine if the game told you you're supposed to go to Junon, right? But then it's like, what you were actually supposed to do was go back to Midgar and then ask, like, and then like Sephiroth was actually like hanging out in the remains of Sector 7, right? After it got crushed, right? Imagine if that was actually what the game did, even though the game told you that, like, oh, the person who everybody believes to be Sephiroth went to Junon, but then you get to Junon and then that wasn't the case, and then you were stuck forever until somehow you figured out, or someone told you because someone miraculously figured out past the lies that Sephiroth was actually in Midgar the whole time, right? Like that the game wouldn't work. The game wouldn't work, right? Because unless someone literally experimented with every possibility, despite all the clues in the game saying otherwise, you would never know. You would never know, right? And so the idea is that truth telling is so vital, right? And it's a fundamental thing in video gaming, right? And I think that's something that, in a gaming culture now, and parents going like, oh, kids playing a lot of video games, whatever. To you parents, a thing you can use and foster with your kids is the importance of truth telling, right? And talking about how video games teach you to be truthful. At least they should inspire you to be truthful, because a video game only works on the basis of that trust, just like how society in general works, right? And that's how anything really works, right? You can't have society if there isn't this mutual trust that you and other people can be truthful to each other, right? You think of how can this, I talk about like video gaming and Final Fantasy VII, but how can truth telling be applicable to everyday life? Well, that's kind of obvious, but the easy examples, relationships, right? Boy howdy, imagine trying to build relationships on lies, right? And of course, that's another thing video games play at, right? Is that, a lot of RPGs narrative is driven by, oh, there's this large organization, often a church group or something, that builds their story on lies, right? And so you as the protagonist have to sift through the lies, and then you overcome the real evil, which was, the thing hidden by the lies, right? Of course, that's why, like, Final Fantasy Tactics is, oh, thanks, Nicholas. Anyway, so that's another reason why I like Final Fantasy Tactics 1. Okay, so that's a game everybody's got to check out, though. Just straight up shameless promotion of, like, an old-ass game, right? Final Fantasy Tactics is a great example of, like, why truth-telling is so important, right? Now I'm going from the mechanical side of video games to a narrative side, right? And Japanese RPGs or JRPGs they love doing this, right? It's like their favorite thing. Every game, I mean, to be fair, it's how you make a good story, right? So you can't fault them for it. Like, everybody plays on the trope because it allows for good storytelling. But, like, oh, the big organization or institution lies to the people and controls people through it, right? And then you have to fight through that. And so Final Fantasy Tactics had a great example of this. One of the best games ever made, by the way. So in Final Fantasy Tactics, basically there's, like, the church around this person named Saint Ajora. And basically you read through what's the thing actually called? The Germanic scriptures, which was written by a guy who was a follower of Saint Ajora, and then you find out that, like, he left Saint Ajora because he found out that Saint Ajora actually wasn't this, like, messiah character, right? And so basically you get some contradicting information because, of course, the game kind of tells you that, like, well, Saint Ajora led the 12 Braves, and the Braves were, like, these great heroes or whatever, right? And then Ajora was the leader of them, da 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 da, right? And then what you find out is actually, like, no, Ajora was a crazy person who wanted to take over the world and was willing to use, like, supernatural powers to do it. And so when people caught on to that, then they executed him, right? But the problem was they were too late when they finally did execute him, because then he implanted his 12 followers with, like, demon spirits to make them powerful, and then they kind of made up this plot to resurrect him, and then they would take over the world. That was the whole premise of Final Fantasy Tactics, which is funny because everybody tries to, like, Fire Emblem Three Houses had, like, original, like, characters with this. Is like, no, the Nemesis and the 11 Elites was basically the same idea. But to be fair, I mean it's not like FF Tactics was original either, right? I mean, that's an old, like I said, that's an old story, right? Tale as old as time kind of thing, right? People trying to take over the world with supernatural powers, and then stuff, goes down, and you as the hero stop it, right? It tells for good storytelling. And so, but the importance of the truth telling is that, like, well, of course the establishment would start crumbling once people started realizing the truth, right? And so, you going back to Final Fantasy Tactics and its plot, the the church was so afraid of how it would lose its power if people knew the truth, and that's why they kept, quote unquote, killing all the heretics, and trying to kill you as well, because you're technically one of the heretics who found out the truth about this. And so that was the idea of why truth telling is so important, right? Because then otherwise, society would crumble. And of course, in the Final Fantasy Tactics world, you kind of start seeing, you only see the seeds of it, of the unraveling, and then of course the ending of the story as well. As a matter of fact, things have changed quite a bit. And then of course, if you were paying attention the whole time, the entire game was like a dude telling you a story about how things began to change, right? And so, that's just one example of how truth telling is so important, and something that video games can help you when it comes to the importance of understanding truth telling. Now you wonder why I would even bother talking about this, right? But I think something important that we run into in our culture today is that there's just so much deceit, and there's so much, just lies that people just spew out, right? All, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about, like, in the political world, or we're talking about how crises are or whatever, right? And this is where the birth of conspiracies theories come in, right? I mean, if you think about it, Final Fantasy Tactics was a story about a conspiracy theory. And so, see, we're so quick to shut down like the idea of people having conspiracy theories, and yet all the best video games are based around people having conspiracy theories. But anyway, um, the idea is that I want to get at today is, as we, in our culture, we have a real problem of truth and how people can trust each other because there's a lack of truth, right? And that's where, it's no wonder that like people are so secretive. That's why people are so distrusting. That's why, you don't really see a lot of people have like meaningful friendships often, right? And that's why you find stuff like it's easier for hookup culture to be a thing than for people to actually get married, right? Or stuff like that. Or to be in, I mean, if you're not a person who's into marriage, like, to have long lasting committed relationships, right? You don't find that as often. And you're seeing a breakdown of, society, not just because of like, oh, people don't hold to like more traditional values. I mean, that's its own thing altogether. But to boil it all down, it's fundamentally, people can't trust each other, right? And why can't people trust each other? Because no one is ever really sure about whether someone is telling the truth. Now, here's the funny thing, right? And I said this in my Exodus streams, and I'll say it again. I mean, even if you weren't a Christian, even if you don't believe in God, right? The fundamental idea of, like, you read through the book of Exodus, and you read through something like the Ten Commandments, you would have to understand that there's a banal goodness to those things, to the Ten Commandments, right? I mean, some of them are kind of obvious, right? Like, don't murder people, right? Like, duh, right? But then, like, do not lie is on the list, right? It's number 9 on the list. And anyone who's a realistic human being, I was going to say was honest with themselves, but I think you need to be realistic with yourself, and then you can be honest with yourself. If you were just realistic, you would see that, like, even if you didn't believe in God, the 10 Commandments hold a binding, how do I put it? It's binding to how we are to live, or how we ought to live, right? That they're not just like platitudes, right? But the fact that, God gave people the 10 Commandments because it was in humans' best interest in how they could live, right? Now, of course, I would make this joke about how, like, well, there's a lot of things the Bible says that we shouldn't say, right? So, the Bible says you shouldn't say lewd things. You should be respectful of people's, like, don't say demeaning things to women. That's what the Bible's getting with. Says don't say lewd things. Um, don't cuss so much, even though I sometimes do it on air, right? Don't be so condescending and judgmental, right? There's a lot of things the Bible says you shouldn't say, but lying makes the list of, like, do not lie, right? As in, you cannot do this. And there's a reason for that, right? Because, when it comes to, like, saying, lewd things, or, being a little judgmental and, swearing, right? A society can survive all those things. But I'll tell you what a society can't survive. Contempt for truth. Because, once again, if people can't trust each other, you don't have a society, right? And so I think that's something that we all need to be really mindful of. And I know it's so easy to, protect yourself, right? And to use lying to protect yourself. Because, that's the other thing about the internet, right? You're not obviously, on the one hand, you should be honest. But on the other hand, you don't just tell people everything about yourself, right? Like, you still need to have your own privacy, and people don't have to know everything about you. That's also true. but just because people don't have to tell you don't have to tell people everything about yourself. You should always make it in your best interest to be truthful, right? And to always be honest, because dishonesty is what's going to destroy a community, right? And so I think that's something that is really important to think about. So that was kind of the bulk of what I wanted to say. Just the importance of truth telling and using video games as a good example, both from a mechanical sense of why being truthful mechanically is important, because you can't play a game without it, being what you're being told of how to play a game. You have to assume it's true, right? But of course, good storytelling is that, like, well, there's an evil organization that lies its way to power, right? And then that kind of has, you run into all kinds of things with that. And I think, I think that's something that, like, as gaming is part of the more mainstream culture now, it's not part of like the fringe thing that, like, when I was a kid and the nerdy kid played video games. Um, but as it became the more popular thing, as it becomes a more popular thing now, I think it's something that we should be very, very mindful of, right? And you think of any of those kind of games that, like, the evil church organization that lied their way to power. I mean, that's just a case in point that we should all pay attention to, right? And Tales of Symphonia is another game. This is just me showing my age of, like, older games that I really like. But, like, Tales of Symphonia is another great example of that, right? Like, how catastrophic it was, and you almost could have ended the world, right? Before your characters found out the truth. But, like, how dangerous lies can be, right? And when people use lies to give themselves power, right? And how dangerous those people are. Well, I mean, that's sure, we don't live in those fantastical, universes with crazy magic powers and stuff, but you can think about that in your everyday life, right? Like, how dangerous people are that would use lies to grasp for power, right? And that was a problem with, like, some parts of YouTube or whatever, where people built their fame on that, and not even before YouTube, right? Like, um, a non-video game example is where Michael Jackson, God rest his soul, got the inspiration, right? Billie Jean, right? The idea that someone was trying to say that, like, well, this, this kid was Michael Jackson's, and he was like, no, clearly not. I don't know who you are, right? And then, of course, that's the premise of, like, Maury Povich, right? Are you the father? You are not the father, right? So, because you know you can't how dangerous it is when people try to use lies to grasp for power, right? Of course, the Bible tells a story many a time, right? I mean, David had to, when David lied to cover his ass of, committing adultery, how much trouble that got him in, right? And then, of course, Abraham gets himself in trouble multiple times for just lying about stuff, right? Because, he's a pathological liar. And so, how dangerous people can be when they just go around committing lies, right? And of course, Jacob is the grand example most people might know from the Bible, right? Where he deceives his dad by pretending to be his brother. And then the catastrophic. Of course, God reworked it and ended up making it work. But how catastrophic it was for Isaac and Esau, right? To that Jacob lied and deceived them, right? And of course, the Bible tells you over and over how, your life will come to an end if you accept lies, because, when when you walk a path of lies, it will just lead to destruction, right? And that's what the Bible gets at when, famous John 10:10 verse, right? The enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Well, that's why he's also, known as the father of lies, right? Because the idea is that his lying is to lead you to destruction, right? That was kind of the idea that the Bible was getting at. And so that's definitely something to be mindful of. And as you play through video games, especially playing like RPGs, and of course, I am a huge RPG fan. If you haven't already figured that out, if you watch the channel and you've watched my video gaming playthroughs, you know the kind of games I like. But if playing an RPG, I think would really enlighten your mind in that regard. And I think people need to take a page out of that, because you see a lot of the stuff going on around that's built on deceit, right? In the world today, you see all this stuff that's just built on deceit, and you see a lot of everyday people just lamenting how terrible things are. It's like, well, no, duh, right? Like, people are just lying through their teeth, and people are buying into those lies, right? I mean, here's a terrible example, but it's just a case in point. Like, there were a lot of good people in Germany when the Nazis were in power, but the fact of the matter is, you don't kill 6 million people because of a few sociopaths, right? You kill 6 million people because you convince a bunch of ordinary people that lies, that lies are truths and that evil is good, right? Which was the lie that the Nazis told. And so the way that the Nazis gained power was to lie to the people and tell them that evil was good. And the fact of the matter is, that is a problem that we are facing in our culture today, right? Many people telling lies that things that are in fact evil are good, for the sake of, them trying to be powerful, or, or whatever. Well, that's usually the reason why, right? It's for power. This is why people lie, especially in like trying to convince ordinary people like you and me that evil things are good, right? And that's the thing that's the thing we need to watch out for. And my funny little advice to you is play a Japanese RPG, right? And watch how events like that fold out in the fictional world. And I always tell this funny story where, like, one thing, like, when my mom would watch me play video games, it's like, oh my god, this was like stupid, whatever, right? And how ridiculous things can get, right? And then I would always now that I'm older, I can just tell her and remind her, is like, well, I think the importance of playing video games, even as an adult, is that, like, the crazy worlds that those video games have, they're not too different from our own. But at the same time, you and I should be eternally grateful we don't live in crazy worlds like that, right? As much as it'd be great to live in like a fantasy place like in the world of Pokemon, but do you really want like a huge ass rat just running around some tall grass? I'm looking at you, Eradicate. Or anything like that, right? But at the same time, you should look at those stories that, video games and RPGs especially present, because they allow you to get a good glimpse of what the world would be like, right? If we allowed people to deceive us and say that evil is good, right? And so in the gaming world, you have some imaginary heroes who can overcome those problems by hitting stuff harder. But how do we deal with those things in the real world today, right? Where there are many people trying to deceive us into believing evil things are good, right? Well, what can you do? How do you fight those evils? And, that's the $64,000 question, right? And so, I don't have an easy answer for that. I mean, the textbook answer would be like, well, find truth in God, right? Find truth in Christ. But I know people say, well, that's just your Christianese answer. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll admit to that, right? But better that than just allow people to deceive me and say that evil is good, right? Got to find some kind of objective, morality to build all your other thoughts on, right? As opposed to just letting people lie to you for their benefit and for their grasp at power. And I can't remember the guy who said it. Should probably look it up. But there's that old saying, you know, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, right? And case in point, you know, that's how many people fall into the many lies that are around today, because we live in a culture that doesn't exactly say like, well, you have to have a particular belief system for you to stand on, right? You can just believe whatever you want, as opposed to like having something for you to build your foundation on. Excuse me. And you know that quote is so true, right? If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Which is ironic that, you know, evil people who grasp for power get that, right? And they will stand on their lies to control you. But, you know, for those of us that believe in truth, you know, stand for it. And don't let those who want to deceive you and take away from you, you know, don't let them succeed. So that's the bulk of what I have to say about this. And I know I didn't talk about the gaming illustrations as much as I thought I had lined up, because I only had like a few and I thought they would last me long enough. But, you know, I think it's just a good exercise for all of us to do. It's just to play, you know, video games and understand the importance of truth telling, and use video games as a vehicle for that, right? Because, you know, many stories, like I said, many video games likes to use the stories of like the evil empire built its power on lies motif, and just kind of see what that looks like. And games can teach you a lot about that, right? How evil empires build themselves on lies, and how you can face those same things in the real world. Because they, you know, the fantasy worlds of video games are not too different from the world we live in. Right? They just kind of have added make believe elements, but at the same time, they, you know, fantasy and storytelling is meant to hit us at the core of our humanity more than what is real and what is not, right? And to be fair, though, you know, and people like Jordan Peterson would say something along the lines of like, well, that meta narrative, right, of knowing that like, okay, there are evil people that will lie to you for power, right? And that is a concept that exists not just in the real world, but it's in all kinds of fantasy worlds. And that's the meta narrative, is an understanding that like, yeah, there are people like that that will deceive you. And so that's something, you know, all of us got to look out for. And I think that's something that, yeah, I think is something a game can teach you, right? And for you to apply to your real life is like, okay, I should be truthful, because imagine the consequences of not being truthful, right? And you know, some games on the recommended playing list, if you want to explore this idea of the importance of truth telling. You know, most Final Fantasy games do it, but like Final Fantasy X for sure has a whole narrative about like a church built on lies. Final Fantasy Tactics is one of them. Um, Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I did play on the channel. You definitely should check out Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is on the channel. You know, that one is a story about like how dangerous it is to build, you know, society on a lie. Um, what else would be on the list? There's a lot of them on there. Near Automata, right? I'm trying to think of what else. What's another good example of that one? The first Bravely Default 1 is a good example of that. You know, there's quite a few of those games, right? They like to play on this idea of like the evil institution, right? But I mean that's how evil institutions are built, right? It's because they had people built they had lots of ordinary people believe lies, and so that's something that, you know, you as a conscious thinker need to really face, right? And when you see these stories play out in the video game world, you know, you can apply that to your real life. And I think that's something that you know, I think it's something we should all do more, right? I mean, not to just say play more video games, but like, you know, to be more critical as we play through games, and how we carry ourselves in the real world, right? And that's something that I think many people underestimate the value of, like stories in general. I mean, this can be, you know, if you're not a gamer, you can think about many books that do this too, right? But, and I'm sure there are a lot of them, right? I mean, obviously, Harry Potter series is a great example, right, of how dangerous it was that, like, why didn't you tell me the truth, Dumbledore, right? You jackass, I wait till the fifth book before you found out, like, anything that was really going on, because so many things earlier was, like, all built on lies, right? Hogwarts, I'm looking at you, right? So, I mean, case in point is, in all these stories, it's really important to study, you know, how dangerous deception is, right? And of course, how do you bring that back to, how you carry yourself around, not just in the real world, but of course on the internet, right? And as I've said earlier, you should always strive to be truthful. But you've always got to watch for people too that are willing to deceive you, right? Just so they can be popular or, you know, have control over you or whatever, right? And of course, you got to watch out for those people because there's a lot of them out there, right? And they're not as obvious as those, prank phone call, those scam phone calls where, like, this is the legal department calling. If you don't want us to, press criminal charges, call this number, and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, I know you're a scam. If I was really a criminal, the police would just come to my house with a warrant, right? They know where I live, so, but anyway, um, you gotta watch for those kind of people, right? And when people, live on lies, that's like bad influences too. I'll tell a story about one of the Discord servers I hang with. Well, I don't hang out in that many, so for those of you that do know, or are from there, watching this video, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But we had a lot of young guys who just part of why, like, okay, on the one hand you can't be too harsh because they're youngsters and everything's like a dick measuring contest. But at the same time, like a lot of young people who just want to be popular, they'll just tell whatever lies, right? To make themselves, seem edgier than they actually are or cooler than they actually are. And I mean, that's a big reason why people lie, right? It's just to create an image of themselves that other people might look up to. I mean, that's one of the funny things where it's like, you think about how, like, Hitler became, like, as powerful as he did, right? I mean, he was a pretty regular guy before, but then, like, he had to make this image of himself that was far more attractive than he actually was, and just lie through your teeth to do it, right? And so that's something that everybody needs to be mindful of, and I think it's been this kind of thing has been on my mind for a while because, of course, like, as I've mentioned, the Discord story about, like, well, I'll tell the story again in case it wasn't clear. There was this younger person. I didn't tell the story, so I'm gonna tell it now. So there's this younger person, and as a young teenage girl, she's very easily impressionable, and I kind of wish I did more to help. I should have seen the signs sooner, but some of these guys just openly deceitful, in their, like, the kind of stuff they talk about, and they were openly deceitful so that they could make themselves look better. And so this young girl kind of looks up to them, and they were bad influences on her, and now she's just as much of a shitty nihilist as they are, right? And so it's really sad to see when people get influenced like that, right? Because it's like, you're 15 years old, like, you can't have such a depressing outlook on life, like, that's really sad to see, but lies will do that to people, just like the lies, and it's a lie that's plagued a lot of young people, right? Now, I know people are going to be like, political warning alert, right? But unfortunately, that's what a lot of people, the woke ideology, has been teaching people, is that, like, just straight up lying to people or telling them lies. Because I'm not going to say that they're lying to them, but they themselves, the people of the woke world, believe in a lie, and then they spread that lie to people. So I'm going to be careful of how I define that they're lying to people, because in their own mind, they think they're telling the truth. But this is what I mean by like how dangerous it is to build a system on lies. You know, going back with the video game illustrations, how dangerous it is when these institutions create their institution on a lie, right? And then people believe this lie, and then everybody starts believing this lie to the point that they can no longer tell it's a lie, right? But, you know, you think of like the woke world and how like they've bought into the lie that like, well, you know, everything's meaningless and it's all about like power struggle, so that's all you should care about. But you have to fight this power struggle because you have no future. These people took away your future. It's like, no, your future is something you can decide for yourself, right? Whatever happened to individuality? Whatever happened to, you know, how do I put it? Whatever happened to like individuality? Whatever happened to like responsibility? Whatever happened to like, you know, growing up and being a person? Whatever happened to that? Whatever happened to independence, right? Instead of buying into the hive mind idea that like, oh, we have no future and that's why we have to rip it out from someone else, right? But the lie was that telling people they have no future is like, no, people have a future. You can go out and create your future, right? And you know, the Christian message part of this, I guess you could say, is that like, well, that was one of the main reasons of like the impact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, for instance, right? Was the idea that like, no, you don't have to believe that there's nothing in life to live for, right? That life is not just a mere like we live and then we die and then just kind of labor our way through that everything else in between. But it's like, no, there is something worth living for. You have a purpose and you are to move toward that purpose, right? Whatever that is, I don't know what your purpose is, and I mean, I'm willing to help you walk along you finding your purpose, right? Because I believe that is my purpose. But you can't live with the mindset that like, oh, you know, we have no future, because that creates dangerous people, right? But those dangerous people are all products of a deadly lie that people have been saying since like the hippie era. That like, oh, you know, there is no future, right? And it's all just gonna end. Everything's gonna just end in like fire and brimstone from the sky because everything is so terrible, right? It's like, no, there's this future. There's a future that we can live for, right? And don't buy into the lies. And you know, using video game comparisons, I mean, that was like the whole premise of uh, like the original Nier Automata, right? Oh, you know, you're just artificial life forms. You weren't created for any real purpose other than to like survive so that some evidence of human civilization. Like, no, right? And of course, you know, the big um, conflict in any artificial life form story is that like, well, just because I'm a created life form, does that mean I can create like purpose for myself, right? And the lie is to believe that no, you can't. But the truth is, yes, you can, right? You can be your own person and, you know, seek your destiny, right? And that's something that, you know, I kind of wish a lot more young people understood. Which is ironic, you know. You see a lot of young people play these kind of games and they don't get that part of the message, right? I mean, that is a good message to teach to people, right? And I think that's a missed opportunity when you don't play games like that. You miss those opportunities of like, well, no, there's a lot of gloom, doom, but the hero's journey is that they fight past that, and in that they find their purpose, right? And so I think that's something that all of us need to, you know, understand more. And that's all the more reason why, you know, back in the book of Exodus, do not lie. Thou shalt not give false testimony to their neighbor, because yeah, lies hurt people. They really do. And so if you're not the best with books, go play video games and learn how to be a truth teller, whether it's through the mechanics of a game or the story of a game where truth is important, right? Because that's something we all gotta. That's all something we need to have in our lives, is that inspiration to be truthful, right? And you got to go find where you're going to get that inspiration, right? But the Bible tells you, you know, it's important that you are truthful because it will hurt people, right? Because, you know, the wording is interesting too in the book of Exodus when it talks about, you know, you should not give false testimony about your neighbor, right? Because neighbor is used in that whole, like, you know, the famous, you should love your neighbor, right? Because they're the same people, right? And those same people that you should love, you should not try and hurt them with lies, right? And how dangerous it is to hurt them with lies. And the funny thing is that video games gives us so many opportunities to be better at truth telling. I know that's a weird statement, right? But video games give us a huge opportunity to be truthful and to teach us to be truthful. Because video games use extreme examples of what happens when you build things on lies. And you should be able to figure out, maybe I don't want that to happen to me. Maybe I shouldn't do that so that terrible things like that don't happen to me. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan, right? You want to have a good life, you just learn how to not hurt people with lies, and then nobody will want to, well, for the most part, other than awful, evil people, but that's its own issue. But for the most part, you know, you're not going to get hurt by the average person if you're not going around telling lies. And so, here's the truth, right? Of course, I know there's the whole what is truth debate, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. I mean, I have my answer, but that's besides the point. The idea is that, you know, don't go around lying to people, right? Don't use the internet as a justification to be deceitful to people, which is one of the biggest problems in our society, right? Is that people can just use the anonymity of the computer screen to just deceive people and then think they're not going to face consequences. But as I've already said numerous times here, there will always be consequences if you choose to lie to people. And video games are a great, great teacher for that. I mean, the right games, anyways, right? But that's besides the point as well. But, you know, you can learn a lot about telling the truth in video games, because video games are built on needing to be honest with people, just like any product you sell to people, really, right? But that is the end of that. I think I've talked enough about video games and the 9th commandment. If you have any questions, you can ask them. Kind of give a little closing story in the meantime. As if you have questions, you can type them up. But I'll tell you a little closing story. Or rather, I'll tell the closing story. So, as I was playing through Fire Emblem Three Houses on the channel, you guys may know, and then I encountered this other guy, and we were talking about Fire Emblem Three Houses, and we were talking about, like, the hot take that, like, Edelgard is a villain and everything, and it's like, well, I know a lot of people simp over her, but, like, yeah, clearly she's the villain, because, like, when she gave that whole speech, and basically when right before the war phase begins, Edelgard gives that whole speech about how the Church of Saros was, like, evil and everything, and Edelgard just straight up lies through her teeth, because half the stuff she says is actually not true at all. But then, like, the other thing too, that this guy I was talking to, he was trying to justify the Church of Saros, and we got into an interesting debate about that too, because I think on the one hand it's like, okay, there's a reflection of modern religion, and yeah, you know, to be fair, you know, most religious institutions should just admit that they've done wrong things in the past. It's just the way it is, right? People do bad things, right? Like, you just own up to it. You can't undo it. But of course, the fatal criticism of Rhea as a character is that, like, well, she may have lied her way, and sure, good things came out of it because she helped people, right? Because she was interested in helping people, to prevent another war, basically. But at the same time, her lies caught up to her, right? And I mean, that's another good example. And Fire Emblem Three Houses is a pretty recent game. I do have a playthrough of it on the channel. Guys should definitely check it out. Shameless self promotion, but it's just a case in point of, like, no matter how good your intentions are as well, lying will catch up to you. And so Fire Emblem Three Houses does a good example of telling that story of how your lies will catch up to you and the damage it does to people's lives, right? And so that's something that we should all pay attention to as we consume media, right? Now, I use video gaming as an easy example because, I mean, lots of people play games now that it's part of the mainstream culture. I mean, this is true of all kinds of books and other stories, right? I mean, that's the beauty of storytelling, that we can learn these important lessons without needing to live through them ourselves, right? Because, I mean, I know people in real life that's happened too, right? I have a guy that I look up to. Won't tell you his name though, but for safety reasons, even though he's paid, his time in prison and everything. I know some people are gonna do the whole like judge him based on who he is in the past and how cancel culture works. But anyway, this guy I look up to, my buddy, a different buddy, of course. He used to be a gangster, and of course with that, a lot of drugs, hurting people, killing people even, right? And when you live that kind of life, you have to lie your way through a lot of things, right? When your wife asks you what you've been doing in the night time or whatever, why you always come home late, right? Stuff like that. But eventually it caught up to him, right? One day he came home, wife took the kids, left, because she found out what he was doing. And when his lies caught up to him, it was devastating, right? Because the people he thought he loved, they left him. And of course, this was years ago. He's long since recovered. He's a pastor now, and he's a role model for me, someone that, like, yeah, I can learn a lot from, and all that. But when he was telling me the story about himself, it was just a reminder of, like, why your lies can really catch up to you. And that's something that, like, okay, like, I make sure, like, okay, I'm always truthful, right? Because I never want to get in that kind of trouble ever in my life, right? Like, I get in trouble for a lot of dumb shit in general, right? Because I'm a bit of a big mouth, and I'm too often a smartass. But, like, the amount of times I've gotten in trouble as being a little smartass will never compare to the amount of trouble I've seen people go through when they've been caught lying, right? And sometimes I've been the instrument of wrath for people's lives, right? Because, of course, I also don't stand up for people who are liars. And so I have been the instrument of wrath to make my sound way more epic than I actually am. But, like, to call out people on lies or whatever, that's basically what I did. And so that's what I actually meant. I mean, like, anyway, so, and some people have tried to make me feel guilty for, like, ruining people like that. Calling out, like, well, what would you rather have? Would you rather have this guy keep lying to you and try to be your friend through his lies and to think that you mean something through his lies? Or would you just rather spare yourself the trouble now, right? I did you a favor, buddy, right? Like, because I've seen how lies can just destroy people. And so I think that's something that I mean, I look back at those times and I'm like, yeah, that's all the more reason we need to fight against the lies that are told in our culture, right? Because if little lies can ruin people's personal lives, right? You can imagine the amount of destruction in a society that can happen when people accept bigger lies. And I talk about like the nihilistic view of like, well, when you convince young people that they have no future, right? The amount of destruction that not only happens in their own lives, but that they do to other people's lives, right? And I mentioned this on my Friday stream when I was reading through the Book of Kings, right? Where, you know, if you're gonna, people that are, how do I put this? Well, the way Jesus says it is if you're not gathering, then you're scattering. And the idea was that, like, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So people that are honest and want to help people, well, they start with their immediate circle, their family usually, and then like their close community of friends, and then expands to like a larger community, like a church community, and then it expands to like helping um, in a like larger societal ways, right? And so I use the example of like um, this group I volunteer with in the downtown east side. Well, I haven't done it lately because of the whole COVID thing, right? But and how the mandates get ridiculous. But basically, I meet people there, and they're the kind of people that are like, yeah, like we believe in fostering people that have hope in a future, right? So we want to help people in our society do that, and they volunteer in these, groups, right? But then, of course, you see the opposite happen, where people that are, you know, they believe they have no future, and so it doesn't just plague them, but they end up being assholes to their own family, and then this is where the internet gets really bad because then they go on the internet and then they start spewing their nihilistic bullshit onto young impressionable minds, as I was giving that story earlier, and then you make other nihilists like yourself, and then you're all just a bunch of no fun, you know, gloom doom sayers, and then nobody likes, and then people hate you because like, then why would I want to be around a person who's just always in a depressing mood and wants to put other people down, right? Why would you want to be around those people, right? Because and that's another reason why you don't want to be around people who lie all the time, right? Because they're the kind of people that would put you down, right? Because I mean, their lies is designed to make them look better than they actually are. But then by a false sense of superiority, then while they're trying to make themselves look good, it naturally pushes you down, if that makes sense, because that's how hierarchies work. And so instead of people being honest and trying to live harmoniously, these pathological liars online, they only are out there to make themselves look good, and they don't care how many people have to look bad in order for them to do that. And that's disgusting, right? That's a terrible way of living. And then you don't want to be the kind of people who influences others to do crappy things, right? And you don't want to be, negativity spreads like a virus, right? And that's something that, you gotta watch out for those people, right? And so that's how I kind of, the funny thing is that's kind of an excuse of like myself being kind of like a jackass at times, right? Because in the sense of like, okay, I may be a bit of a smart ass, but you know, I would never put you down, kind of thing, right? Like, and truth telling is a big part of how you do that, right? Because when you're truthful, you're always vulnerable, right? And then people can trust you. And trust is hard to build. And so if I really, and that's another thing too about like, well, fundamentally, the idea of any pastor is to lead people to belief. Well, that's not going to happen if like I'm disingenuous with people, right? That's obviously not going to happen. So I think that's something that we also need to be extremely mindful of. Anyway, that's it for that story. Long-winded story. But it was something that I wanted to talk about for a little while. It's just like the importance of telling the truth. And then a funny thing that I would always kind of make jokes about. I was like, yeah, video games are, video games teach us the bad habit of taking people at their word. And that statement, when I said that to myself, I was like, that was kind of another thing that inspired this video. I was like, ah, when people try to make an argument, if you want to make a good argument of why video games are bad, the good argument would be, well, video games teach you to be too truthful, right? And that you should always assume people are deceitful, which is a very nihilistic way of thinking, but like, funny way of looking at life, I guess, because I have a dark sense of humor. I'm terrible, right? That's probably why I don't work in a church right now. But I'm terrible, right? Like, oh, it's like just destroying myself here. But hey, it's okay to laugh about myself about that. But okay, I kind of lost. Okay, so yeah, the inspiration is that, like, video games teach us a bad habit of taking too many things at face value, right? Because of course, we should always be critical thinkers, but that's not what I meant when I was like, well, video games, they teach us to be truthful, right? Because, if there's no honesty, then you have no grounds for rules, and rules are kind of important for how to keep a community, and by extension society, afloat. And that's especially something important now, as society is very shaky, and that's putting it lightly, right? But you gotta stand up for truth in the face of how lies are destroying people's lives. You gotta stand for truth, right? Because the truth will set you free. Anyway, that's basically going to be the end of this video. I need to really fix this lighting. I'm just looking at like a OBS thing, and it's just like, I look a little dark. Let me know if like it ends up being too dark or too bright. I really need your feedback on it times, because the thing about this room that I'm in is that, like, we actually don't have the room itself doesn't have any light. I actually have like I just have like a bunch of lamps in here, and then they make light. But lamps are not a great way to like make lighting for streams. Like, this is terrible. This is terrible, right? And then of course, like, the thing about lamps is that, like, the inconsistency of it is like, if I move any way, the lighting appearance will change so much, right? Even if I move a little bit. And so I need to somehow get that fixed. It's a pain. But anyway, yeah, this is gonna be the end of the podcast. You guys kind of humored me in, talk about video games and Do Not Lie, and how they relate very closely, oddly enough. At least I think they do. I mean, they have to. I have to think they relate closely in order for me to promote playing more video games, to learn how to be a better truth teller. So I obviously believe that, but I mean, that's something for you to think about yourself, right? And maybe that will help you be more critical when you play games and think through stories as you play through a game. Hopefully I inspired you to do that, at the very least. But anyway, this is gonna be the end of the stream, just for a bit of housekeeping. Thursday, we'll have our Throwback Thursday video. I know I haven't streamed Wednesdays in a while, but I'm trying to sort out something with somebody. Talkie. Maybe we'll do something for a couple of Wednesdays in October, because I know he wants to do something. But he's been like busy with stuff. Mainly, like, he's really trying to find more full-time work. So he's really focusing on that. So he hasn't gotten back to me about anything, because he's not sure about any scheduling. That's the real reason why he hasn't said anything to me. So we're gonna sort that out, and of course he will be my first guest in the podcast. And once again, I gotta harass him a little bit, because I'm a little bit too nice, I think. I should probably get a stick and just be like, Talkie, answer me, damn it. And be like, we doing this thing on Monday or what? So it's supposed to be the 4th of October. I will get I need to get a true confirmation. So if it's not the 4th, we'll do it on the 11th. Of course, the 11th is a little touchy because it will be Thanksgiving. And if he doesn't join me on Thanksgiving Day, I will do a Thanksgiving kind of hangout podcast and probably have someone else speak. And then of course, if that ends up happening, then Taki won't be the first guest. So that's why I'm trying to get him on the 4th. And he wanted earlier in the month, so we'll see. But I still want to announce that Taki will be on the show, and he has a fun topic for you guys as we approach Halloween. Even though yes, October 4th is still early, but hey, Fire Emblem Heroes will release like Halloween units on like the first weekend of October or the second weekend of October. So I think it's fair game if I say October 4th and we're doing Halloween themed stuff, right? So that's gonna be kind of fun for next week. And then of course I'm jumping ahead here, but as far as this week is concerned, nothing out of the ordinary, which is Heroes of Might Magic 2 on Thursday, and continuing the Book of Kings on Friday. I should be pretty close to finishing First Kings on Friday, because we're doing the Elijah story, at least some of it, because the Elijah story is pretty long. So I think that's going to take me 2 streams, and then of course Elijah's story ends First Kings, right? And then as we get to Second Kings, we get to his successor, which we'll talk about him eventually in a couple of weeks, obviously. But this Friday we'll start the Elijah story in the Book of Kings, so definitely check that out because Elijah is a grand old character. He's fun. He's fun to read and talk about. But definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. So Thursday will be a video upload, so you don't have to keep your timetable too open or too clutch for that one. Friday will be 3 o'clock Pacific time. Since it is the Elijah story, we may spend a fair amount of time on it. So that one, I feel like it's going to be a longer stream. That would be this coming Friday. And then, of course, it'll be October, right, when we start that, because that would be October 1st. And then October 4th, I'll try to have Taki on here as my guest. I'm looking forward to having him on the show, because, you know, he's a great guy. He's a cool dude. And he's got a fun topic for you guys. So, hope you guys will definitely check out next Monday's podcast. Because I know these first few podcasts just kind of picking stuff up. I'm just going to talk about basic things. Just some stuff I've thought about overall. And one reason why I started this podcast in general. But anyway, this is going to be the end. Because I think I've done all the housekeeping. This is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed talking about video games and truth. I know that's a weird statement to say out loud. But just roll with it. And, you know, I hope I inspire you to be more truthful. And yeah, that's going to be the end. So I hope you guys have a great week. I will see you guys on Thursday for Throwback Thursday. And then I will see you guys next week as well for another podcast. Hopefully Taki will be there, because I haven't prepped anything for next week yet. Because I'm really hoping Taki would show up. So I gotta go harass. I'm gonna go harass him now, actually, as a matter of fact, as I finish this stream. So I really should try and get a confirmation on him with that. But anyway, hope you guys have a great day, and God bless you.